Way up. Patrick let me know that if anybody in the audience wants copies of what we put together for the email information on comments, themes, how many from where, those will be available in the back? Okay, back corner. So if anybody wants that information, media, that's for you as well. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. We're going to start off with Dr. Bertram, and then Dr. Freitas had some comments. Dr. Bertram.
Ready to go? Thank you. Actually, just some comments and then a couple of final questions. And I know some of our panel's not back as well, but as I think and I look at this work, and I also acknowledge and appreciate the work of the panel and everyone who has shared information, and either today in testimony or in some other form of communication. I think it's greatly appreciated. As I think about all of this, I think the premise that the high school diploma is insufficient, I believe is accurate. Just as I believe that for many people, a college degree is insufficient. While we continue to challenge this whole idea of a high school diploma, we also continue to sell worthless college degrees. And I mean that in a very sincere way, that degrees that just don't match with the demands of the workforce. And so I think that whole alignment is going to be real important for us in how we develop currency for our students moving forward. There are two or three things that I've seen in this that I think are real. It's interesting that when I talk with policymakers, and again, this is not a criticism, it's just I want to make at least a comparison, that when we talk about various big initiatives, I often hear, well, we don't have the money to do that. We can't afford to do that. Talk with business leaders and ask them about doing things, it's like we can't afford that. It's time, it's money. When educators say that, we're making excuses. Right? And I think that's to me, a very important issue, that funding is real, right, at a local level. And the reality is we have resources, but there are also trade-offs. And not every school district is in the same situation, both in overall funding as well as when it comes to capacity and the size of a school district. I've been in small districts and I've been in very large districts. And there are differences, and we have to acknowledge that. So one of my hopes moving forward is that we continue to acknowledge this issue and think about how we align resources around some of these big ideas and big initiatives that we have. A couple other things, such as guidance staff. I have, for many years, talked about the need for career guidance and guidance counselors in our school. Even national averages, we have over 500 students per guidance counselor, and it's woefully insufficient and something that we have to make an investment in. The other big thing around guidance counselors, and many will, I think, attest to this, that during this era of accountability and testing, many of our guidance counselors have become test administrators rather than being able to work with children. And I think if we're going to really focus on career learning, we have to make sure we have the resources in place in our schools to actually counsel students and spend time with them. Mobility does matter, and mobility is a big issue. It's a big issue in most school districts, and some even more pronounced. We have schools, and I was in one of these districts as a superintendent, in which we had schools that over half our students were different at the end of the year than at the beginning of the year. So how we address the mobility issue is going to be really important. Particularly if students are well down a pathway and they switch schools, how are we going to deal with that? These are logistic, these are just implementation issues that I think we have to acknowledge. The other is, how do we align our accountability system with the change of pathways? And I think this is going to be a legislative issue as well. Obviously with end-of-course assessment, I am completely in agreement with end-of-course assessments going away. I just don't want end-of-course assessments to be replaced with ASVAB. I think there's something more important we can do for students to advance learning. So it's not a trade-off, but rather what is the additional opportunities we provide for students, but then do we have an accountability system that truly aligns with the outcomes we're seeking? If we're talking about college and career readiness and having students prepared for a workforce that's very important for them and their economic prosperity, then do we have an accountability system that's aligned with that and rewards that? as opposed to a lot of inputs. I think that's going to be important. The other is just what, the whole waiver process is going to be really important for us. And the last thing I believe is really important, and this is around the locally created pathways and what kind of flexibility we provide for schools in doing that. And from my perspective, I hope that we give schools maximum flexibility and allow schools to create pathways that are meaningful for students. It's easy to stand in judgment of those. It's easy for us to, or anyone in any particular position based on our own frame of reference, to decide whether we think something is sufficient for students, but I would hope that we would leave it to our educators to make those informed decisions. The last question, or the question I have after all of that, is really two big questions. One deals with the whole issue of diploma types. And I know it becomes a legislative issue, as Representative Boehning pointed out, but I think it's a big issue for our state, even beyond the pathways. It's how we deal with the issue of the federal definition of graduation, and what that looks like for our state. And my hope is that we don't allow a definition to create a narrative around our state that is unnecessary. And it really doesn't reflect the true value of what we're delivering in schools. My question is, who is responsible for the regulations, the implementation of this plan? Will this be moved from, obviously, the legislature said to the state board, here's, create a panel, create pathways, and this is where we're at today, and a decision we have to make soon. And the next question then, after that happens, where do the regulations come from? Is it the state board, or is this now the Department of Education that will be responsible for all the regulations on the implementation of this? Do we have a sense of that at this point?
Representative Boehning? Anyone?
I think it's a combination of both. I think certain things will be the responsibility of the Board of Education, and I think the Department of Education will have other things.
I believe that, and I would agree, I think most of the responsibility for regulations and rulemaking is going to lie within the state board, not within the department in terms of rulemaking, but it's definitely going to be partnership in terms of implementation. I don't see the General Assembly getting involved other than trying to fund what it is you're requesting. That would be the General Assembly.
Vince, if I could too, because I have said this, I was actually going to say this tomorrow, so I might say it again, and I was trying not to be redundant and say the same thing over. But I think for me, there's been three pieces here. One, what's the pathway? What is the pathway going to be with those gateways within and what have you, and that being passed or whatever, right? Number two is, how do we support schools? And there's been some work done already, as you've seen, according to the locally created pathways as to what that might look like. And then three is what I've been saying. And again, I want to say that this is Byron talking here, not talking for the board or whatever. This has just been my opinion as we've worked through this. I believe personally, we as a board have to own this as we move forward. And what does owning look like? I'm going to quote, and I did ask him if I could do this. Hardy Murphy and I were talking about this, and Hardy was involved as a collaborator in this as we went through, and he cautioned me. He said, Byron, you guys are going to have to monitor, look at this as it goes. And when I say that, I'm not talking from a punitive standpoint, because I am in total agreement with you. We need the flexibility. We need local schools to be doing what they need to do. But we're also going to need to look at the data, as you suggested. How do we now have 98% of our students graduating from an ASVAB standpoint, right? Or where do we have, or where are we in local pathways in that? And we know, and what Hardy said to me is, you're going to have to do that research or have somebody analyze that for you and help you with that, because one, you're going to get the data, and I think the last few days have proven that. We have gotten all kinds of data, right? And sometimes I've questioned, I'm not sure how you figure some of that, right? But we've gotten data, and so I think, so my answer to that is, from my personal perspective, is we will have to own this. And I've said all along, we're going to have to find ways as we go to, we may need to tweak pieces of this, right, as we go. I think it was Superintendent from Brownsburg, I've been quoting him on this as well, made the comment during one of the panel meetings, and he said, and I think it's genius, is, you know what, we want you to monitor this as you go and make changes as are needed and tweaks. Don't come back in 3 years and say, well, we need to form another panel and refigure what this looks like. How about you do something, and then, that wasn't what he said. I'm saying, why don't we do something? And then, if there are things that need to be done to make it better, because there will be. I think we'd be very arrogant to think that there won't be ways to make this better, right? And so I think that's going to be a piece that we have to own. I went way beyond.
No, I think it's and I appreciate the response. I just also know in many public policies, the tendency is to become more restrictive rather than more flexible. And the question is, how do we maintain that flexibility for schools? You know, so the point that if is there anything in this plan that would suggest if there is a predominant flow toward any particular area that would cause us concerns? You mentioned ASVAB at 98%. If that happens, is there a concern about that? Or is that just the avenue we've given schools and that's what they choose to do? Is that the flexibility they have? You know, or what are the safeguards we put in place early on to know what those restrictions are going to be? We've seen it in federal legislation. It's the same issue we have around graduation rates right now. It's the exact issue. So what we found is states started creating multiple diplomas. The federal government comes back and defines it as your predominant diploma, which puts us at the core 40 and above, and eliminated the general diploma. Right? All because of the way it was implemented at a state level. If that translates into an LEA and how they do that, then we have to deal with those issues as well. And that's my concern, is making sure not only do we have the flexibility, but we continue to give schools more flexibility to meet the needs of their students. And recognizing that not every school has the same level of resources. If you get into a rural area, and we're talking about work-based learning, yes, there are virtual opportunities and so forth, you know, but they're not the same as being in a workplace. Right? They're just not. But if you have a Toyota facility next door, and you have a service station in your community, those are vastly different, and all it does is perpetuate inequities. And I want to make sure that we have the flexibility to address those issues. And if we do, I'm very supportive of a plan that allows us to move forward, raises expectations for students, gives them real-world experiences, and allows them to, and hopefully prepares them for the workforce, which is going to be real important for us. So thanks again, Byron. Thanks for your work.
Madam Chair? Yes. So in follow-up to that, I think it might be appropriate. One of the things in listening to the feedback, both provided verbally today and then also in writing, is a fear that this is a gotcha. We've set up a gotcha system in order to have various opportunities to promise flexibility and to give opportunities for different schools to meet the needs of their students and to really focus on being resourceful and not being limited by limited resources. And so I wonder if it might not be an appropriate time for us to commit to passing these pathways in whatever form is finalized tomorrow or at a future time, that is not the intention. The intention of the locally created pathway, which really does allow many of the comments that we heard today expressing concern about specialized student populations. How might school districts work together to ensure that every student has a choice-filled life, which is what we're trying to do with this particular piece of policy. And so I think it's an appropriate time to speak to that and to give our commitment to making sure that pathways that the intention is not to be the gotcha analysis, but that it is to facilitate that sort of community-centric development of opportunity for students. Of the panel about that intention.
Actually, that was the intent of the locally created pathway, that there would be total flexibility. And we heard testimony from a number of people who came forward about very specific kinds of things that would serve their particular community. And I don't think anyone on the panel disagreed with that we thought that was a great thing. We're trying to promote innovation at the community level, and every community is a little different, and the resources are different. So you really have to look at what are the available resources, and if I do want to move forward in a locally created pathway, what would that look like, and how can I capitalize on the resources that I have? So there's no intent to say you don't have the resources and you're going to be forced to do a particular pathway. The intent has always been to provide flexibility to those communities who want to move forward. So I think there's going to be a number of communities who are going to meet a number of pathways here, plus the locally created if they want to. But again, these are choices at the local level. No one's mandated to do all of these pathways. So I think one of the first things that needs to be done at the local level is an assessment of what resources, what interests do we have, which of the pathways meet our community needs, and then move forward to see how that happens. I think there's going to be few districts that are going to do all the pathways, and I think that's fine because it should be led by community needs. Since I have the floor, the other point I wanted to make was...
1 second.
Okay.
Terry, did you have a comment for Kate?
In terms of flexibility, when we look at already the parameters, though, that are set up for the locally created pathways, that's a long, the memo that already outlined it. For a small corporation that does not have a staff, I mean, my corporation, to give you an idea, does not have a single stoplight in the entire corporation. Not a single stoplight in the entire corporation. My central office is 3 people. It's a secretary, it's a treasurer, business person, and it's the superintendent, and that's it. You know, I mean, we're bare bones. And so when you look at that list of creating a locally created pathway and the amount of, you know, making business connections and data and collecting data and reporting data and doing, I mean, all of that's going to rely on one counselor who's serving the entire corporation. And so the opportunity to create lots of locally created pathways is going to be, he's going to be a busy man if he's trying to do that and build up our CTE program and create opportunities for internships with businesses that we don't have because, again, there's not a single stoplight in our corporation. And so I would love to think about there's lots of flexibility, but when that list already came out with the memo of kind of requirements, that's a long list already in terms of being flexible for us. And I use us as an example because we're not alone. And so, you know, when I hear Vince talk about flexibility, I just already am thinking, I wish we had flexibility. I wish some of our kids had those opportunities, but they, you know, they're not going to have some of those opportunities that are going to be accessible to kids in other places.
Because I've had a lot of people reach out and say, where did that come from? Because I never heard discussion. So I think it'd be a good time for the chair to maybe address where that memo came from. Like, where did we come up with those parameters that are a little daunting?
Well, and so you know, if you talk about like then the work ethic certificate, and so, you know, if we could have that, the work ethic certificate is a pathway, but then are we going to put limits on it? Is that going to be limited in how many people can get a certain pathway? Because if we can only offer so many, again, because of the size of our corporation, and then you start limiting what ones are options for us or how many kids can be on certain ones, it starts getting harder and harder for us to reach those.
Sure. I'm going to go back to where I started. I spent a half a day in a school with a concerned principal just talking about the pathways. And and having talked with that person and talked with teachers at that school, I came home enthused because, and Katie, you pointed out, I think one of my things that I maybe have failed at in this process of, I truly have looked at this always as a high school guy through the student's eyes, not from a punitive standpoint. I have never seen this as being punitive. And that's probably a failure on my part that I didn't look at it in those ways to think through what that could look like, right? I looked at it as being the creative guy who now could create all these things at a school, you know, that I really liked doing as an ag teacher, right? And so that would be that. But I say that because I came home from that school visit very enthused about, you know what, we have got to do something to make sure that we're helping the schools with their implementation and help them with that locally created pathway. So again, this was created out of genuine wanting to help schools, and it clearly comes back to bite you a lot of times, right? So I got on the phone and ended up getting Representative Boehning involved. Sorry, I keep throwing you under the bus today, don't I? And I said, you know what? What can we do? How can we do? We're going to need some help with this, right? How can we do this? Where's the money? Could you get me a couple $1 million? Could we do this, right? And of course, I swung the pendulum of, hey, let's just let's help them and do whatever, right? And so then a discussion ensued, and this is where that out of them really believing that we do need to help schools, they worked on what I've learned now as an educator. PD for me was professional development, but it's a preliminary draft. See, I have learned for legislation, and that's where that came out of, was that first look at what that could look like. Is this final? I don't think so, right? I think it was up for discussion, and so it was that first look at how could we get some support. How could we get that for schools? That's where that came from. Have I missed any of how that came about?
I really don't know where that I mean, I didn't work directly with Alicia on that, so I don't know where. I assume maybe some of our staff did. I will say, going to Carrie, though, what was presented was, number one, the true reflection of what you're talking about, your district, and the district that Dr. Ernest went to as a rural district as well. I don't know what district you're in, so I can't tell you whether it's the same district or not. Anyway, it's really a reflection of the fact that, yeah, we understand that creating some of these may be a challenge. So why not help bring some people to the table to make it happen? And the other issue is, how do we get so that you can replicate that? So say maybe the principal that he talked to ends up creating that panel or create that local pathway, and it is a similar situation. It's going to be publicly available so that your school district could pick it up and put it into play. And not every one of these requires you to have a employer that's going to be embedded. I mean, one of them was envisioned to be a fine arts, pathway, and you could be using existing staff and just create a pathway of interest to kids. And so, I mean, I think we were trying to be as flexible as possible, and I had just briefly looked at that document, but I mean, I would give more money than what that document said in terms of grants and some of those things, but I think it's just
we get that on record. It's on record.
I'm one of 150. But in the PD that we would have drafted, it would actually be a greater amount than that. But I just think that the goal is to try to look at that, understand that, yeah, there's limitations. How do we provide those? And it doesn't say, and like I said, I have not intently, I've seen the document just briefly. I think that in panel, suggestion from, I believe the panel was that these local created pathways involve either businesses or higher ed, and I think either or together, so that you have some currency for students after they graduate. I mean, that's really been the whole focus of the panel, is making sure that students have the ability to either get military, find a job, or post-secondary options are readily available for them when they graduate.
And I think all that is really important. I think it goes back to the point of flexibility, though. So when I look at any particular area, let's take CTE, and Project Legal Aid was mentioned earlier. So I'll use that as an example since I know a little bit about that. So a student takes Introduction to Engineering Design, Principles of Engineering, and Digital Electronics, they've met a pathway. If they're going to take dual credit, it could end up in some linear pathway, or it could be just disparate type of courses. So they could take a dual credit course in U.S. history and then take one in government and another course, and they've met the requirement. So what is the difference in a student wants fine arts and takes drawing and 2D and 3D art, and that's their pathway?
That's the same question.
I mean,
One of the
it's-
visions, I think that, and I think, how you create it is, up to the locals. The one thing I failed to mention is that as we would have those be available to be replicated, but we'd also want to have you partner with some groups out there. I mean, there's groups out there. I think of Horizon, ECHO, statewide groups that are out there actively working with employers, which could help facilitate that. And there's also groups that can also come out and work with us and school districts to help create the curriculum and the text for these programs that would embed the foundations. I think the one thing that we always want to be focused on, which we've already talked about, is having the foundations in language arts and math, so that the students, if they change their mind and start down that fine arts pathway and decide, I want engineering, that they haven't hit a brick wall and can't move that way. So that those would automatically, as they partner together, they would be embedded in it. And then the way I would envision this is that you get the grant, you follow, you work together collaboratively, it's automatically approved and available to the district to implement, and then available statewide for other districts to pick up on it as well, be it, Project Lead the Way or Fine Arts or whatever.
Yeah, so once a pathway is approved, then it's available to every school.
Well,
So
and in this case of the grant, the way I would envision it is that you wouldn't even have to, as long as you follow the parameters, working with the facilitators in your community and, making sure the text has the language arts and math that that it wouldn't require any approval process. It would automatically be.
Yeah, because all of that's going to be based in the high school diploma, correct? So really, the math, science, English, all those classes are already in
Correct.
category 1.
Correct.
So this is the plus side. And that's what I'm saying, when I think of potential pathways that could align with any of these, and just compare them with what could happen in some of the other pathways. I can take several of these pathways, like the AP, IB, dual credit, Cambridge, and CLEP, and say I can have courses that don't really create a pathway at all. It's just a collection of courses that I've taken. And I would say that is meaningless in terms of what's going to happen from a career perspective. I could actually create a much stronger pathway by aligning courses that I already have. And many of these things are going to be things that schools are already doing. And now they're just going to focus students on those things. If they're already offering AP, now more students are going to have to take it. They're already offering dual credit. So how they can align their existing courses to create a pathway for a student, I think schools need the flexibility to do that. When I heard you say, Representative Boehner, I think you said this should be up to the locals. And I think if we think about that from a policy perspective or a regulation perspective and give them that flexibility, I think it mitigates some of the major concerns that we've been hearing.
And Dr. Ernest actually had an example of an ag science program that he was talking about creating, or that had created at one point in Lebanon, where they actually had cross-curricular discussions on that program, brought in math, language arts, and this program was created, which would be a logical pathway. In his community in Lebanon, it was agro-science business that had an office that was willing, that really wanted to create a logical pathway for employees to work in their operations. So, I mean, those are the kind of things I think that my vision would be, that you're kind of giving a lot of opportunity for innovation. and create. It's not trying to be micromanaging, but really.
Madam Chair.
Hang on, is this in regards to Kate's comment? Because I promised Dr. Freitas like an hour ago, and then I'll come back to you.
It leads to those two, but by all means.
Okay, I
keep it going.
apologize. I will come back to you. Okay,
Absolutely.
Dr. Freitas, 1 hour later, you're up.
Thanks. As a student would say, I can't remember my question. No, my comment was certainly the panel spent hours and hours. Someone mentioned 100 or 200 hours. I think that might be accurate. I also want to call out the collaborators that came to 8 or 9 or 10 meetings. We had students with us. I think they were with us for 3 hours and really hearing what they had to say. And I think we had public school teachers, public school administrators, employers. And so as people question the process today, I think there really are a lot of myths out there. And so I understand maybe we could have done a better job in communicating some of this, but I just want to ensure you that a lot of different people did have input into it. And what was really unique, thanks to Dr. Ernest, was the notion of collaborators. We didn't ask these people to come in and to provide testimony. They actually sat at the table with us, and we had a discussion with them, and we asked them questions, and it was probably one of the most enlightening experiences that I've had, and I see some panel members saying, yes, it was. So I want to assure the public that we really did take this seriously and talk to a whole slew of people, in addition to you who provided testimony either online or in person. The other point I want to make is this is a visionary document. And being a visionary document, and it's really a framework, the details are not going to be there yet. And the details come after we pass it or not pass it, but if we do pass it, there's a regulatory process in which we create those details. And we'll have staff put the details on it, and then that's submitted back to the State Board of Education for approval. But prior to it coming back to the State Board of Education, there is a process for you to provide public input again. And so when we get to those details and have those details in draft we expect a lot of you to come back and provide input on that also. So some of the things that you focus in on are really important, but they're frankly a little premature at this point. So I would say the next step is to look for those regulations and then provide input back to us. And we'll take those into consideration and finally have a final vote on those regulations. The State Board is setting policy, and the implementation takes place of those regulations within the Department of Education. And so hate to give you a little civics lesson on that, but there seems to be some confusion. So hopefully that cleared up where those details are going to come from. I turn to my fellow board members. Anyone want to comment on this notion of having collaborators versus testimony? Was that useful to you or not?
I would just like clarification to your point, because I asked that question earlier around the regulations of this. And I didn't hear that it would be the Department of Education that is fully responsible for all the regulation and implementation. I heard it was the State Board and potentially the Department of Ed. So I want to make sure we're clear on.
Right. It's my understanding that board staff are going to draft a set of regulations, and then the proposed regulations will come back to the State Board to release them to the public. And then there's a period of public input on those regulations, and then finally the regulations come back to us. And we have our board attorney sitting here, so I will ask them to comment.
Yeah, so I think the implementation, I think Dr. Freitas is correct, the implementation would come through the department and local districts. As a state board and state board staff, we will definitely be providing resource documents, and that's in collaboration with the department and local districts and teachers and administrators and superintendents. And so from a state board perspective, we can provide whatever resources we can, FAQ documents, guidance documents, things like that, and also to help disseminate information about what districts are doing, and other stuff,
Other states.
other helpful stuff,
Other states.
and information from other states as well.
Does anyone want to comment on the process by which we had collaborators versus testimony given? Was that a positive experience for people? Carol?
I really enjoyed having the collaborators. It was, when we had those that would give public comment, it was very helpful, but there was no opportunity to question or have the dialogue. So having the collaborators at the table I felt was really good because we could ask questions, seek clarification, and have that important dialogue.
Can I ask a follow-up on that? Sure. Is that okay? Does anyone want to speak also to we spoke a little bit about the fact that there were students who had been in a pathway-like setting, experiencing that and the impact that it had on them. I don't know, I have not heard us talk about that in terms of how that influenced where we went with the development of the pathways, but that seems to be a very important component to, excuse me, talk about the impact of the student perspective and the student story. There were students of all ability levels, correct? I mean, there were students that were engaged in CTE level programming. There were students that got their first year of college done. I mean, there were students from across all of the different population types about whom we want to make sure that we are thoughtful in doing this. So I think that should also be mentioned in terms of that was part of the calculus here of how all of that was put together, and that doesn't seem to have come out very much in our conversation today.
I guess I'll take the first crack at it. I think one of the things that resonated for me hearing the students was that many of them, although they were successful and they liked their opportunities, by and large, they all felt like there was this arbitrary divide between they were asked to make a hard decision between doubling down on academic coursework or applied coursework. It was almost more of a college or career ready as opposed to college and career ready. And I think part of the impetus behind the pathways as they're developed is to create a foundation for there to be a blend of those two things, so that students who are very gifted academically, have done really well in traditional liberal arts, dual credit, and AP courses, they very well likely would benefit from opportunities like our CTE type student to apply that learning in a non-classroom type context. Likewise, our students who are track down CTE pathways, they would benefit from a more well-rounded academic coursework that challenges in that regard. And so I think if nothing else, there's an opportunity here with these pathways that we're providing, as Dr. Bertram said, an opportunity to put together some more coherent course sequences that really do provide students some clarity in terms of their direction post-high school, and also provide them some currency post-high school as well. That was the thing that stood out for me, Carol, or others.
Absolutely, and part of the conversation that we had when the students were there were around work ethic and soft skills. And right now, the pilot program for the work ethic certificate is really for students that may not be college bound. And what we are hearing from a lot of employers is those soft skills and those work ethic skills really need to be for all students. And then we also had some discussions on maybe the terminology of college and career readiness is not exactly the right term. It just really needs to be focused on career readiness, because whether they are going straight from high school into a career or going to have some sort of post-secondary education and then a career, the goal is still career. So those were some of the things that were very enlightening to me, to have some of those conversations with those students. And some feedback that I gave to Dr. Ernest and to staff was a lot of these students that were there, this is my only complaint, seemed to be very successful students, and I didn't feel like we had as many students that really didn't have a pathway. And so those were the students that I was more concerned with, on how the development of these pathways will help that community of students. The students that we spoke to, a lot of them were valedictorians. They were very engaged in their school. They were on a path to success, and that's great. We had one student that came who was not a collaborator but came to testify in the crossing, and his story was the one that touched me the most and the one that I wanted to make sure that we had a great product for him to make sure that he doesn't get lost in the process.
Sorry, you've been patient.
I think back to Katie's point, I held meetings after we received the final draft in Southwest Indiana and Southeast Indiana. And I had dual lenses here. I grew up in, as Carrie alluded to, small town USA. We have one stoplight, so I guess we win that one. But I talk with that group as well as Evansville-Vandenberg School Corporation. So it's two separate lenses, but they both share the excitement for the fact and the potential that the locally developed pathways offer. Actually, driving here, I received a call from one of the smallest districts in the state of Indiana that said, hey, if there's going to be a pilot program, we'd love to be a part of it. And going back to Carrie's point of capacity, his thought was, I would love to work with 2 or 3 others, because again, he's a superintendent with no assistant supers. There's 3 people in his main office as well. His conversation was, I'd like to work with surrounding superintendents, 3 or 4 around me, because to Carrie's point, they all share the same problems. That's their staff. So those folks are going to want to work together to create a locally developed pathway that would serve all of those students. As long as it's regionally based, that seems like that professional conversation would be beyond valuable.
One of the things that I've noticed, if you go back 20 plus years, first of all, this is not necessarily a new concept. Over 20 years ago, we had career pathways conferences in Indiana. But the difference that I see in this is at that time we were trying to create by design and through the design all these various pathways around various industry sectors. Healthcare, we had, that was very expansive and very challenging. But a lot of times it was just the alignment of courses. It wasn't necessarily the creation, it was helping students understand that if you have an interest in a particular area, these are the kind of courses that will serve you well. This is the kind of background you need. So if you want to go into healthcare, here are things that would be helpful for you to prepare you for that type of pathway. Our students aren't going to graduate from high school ready to go do that stuff. They're going to be ready to pursue the next step. And I remember having a student that wanted to go into massage therapy, creating an individual pathway for that student. Right? That included anatomy and physiology and weight training and other things that really aligned for that pathway. That's what I want to see from the locally created pathways, is the flexibility to allow us to create an individual pathway. And I know it's a heavy lift, but at the same time, we do that now. As we are working with students preparing their schedules, we are asking them those type of questions. We're helping them create a schedule, but rather than just putting in classes, we can actually create pathways for them that lead to some better outcome. And again, we just have to make sure the flexibility remains at the local level to do that. Otherwise, what we're going to create are state Board of Education pathways. That's not what we're looking for. We're looking for locally created opportunities. And if we can do that, I feel that this could be a very strong plan for our state moving forward.
Questions or comments from the board?
Yes.
Dr. Yeager?
Yeah, thank you. Let's go back to locally created pathway parameters. Is that on the agenda tomorrow, Matt? When did this come about? Give me a birth time for this parameter. I mean, it's fine, but if you can... Okay.
Before Thanksgiving.
This is the first time I've seen it, and maybe I've missed some things. How long ago? Last week? My point. We're supposed to look at this, understand this, and vote on it tomorrow? And how is that fair to the board members to know and understand? Because the feedback I'm getting from people, local people, who have seen at the ground level, who have seen this say, impossible. Another example of backing up, making sure that this is a doable issue. and backing up and saying to our local teachers, our local principals, counselors, and superintendents, we think you can do this. But who had input on that? Dr. Ernest, I know you said you had input on it. Who else had input on that?
Staff provided support for it.
How many K-12 traditional school educators were in that? That's my point. To develop local created pathway parameters document. How many K through 12 people are involved in that?
In the drafting of that document?
Yes. None. That's my point. We can't continue to do this without the ground level people saying this will work, because there's some support in parts of that, but there's also some fear in parts of that. So you have to back up, and we have to back up, and I don't think we should have something thrown at us last week that was put in the agenda and expect us to vote on it when we haven't had a chance to vet it with our local people.
Well, as a staff, our job is to provide recommendations to the board, so I would suggest board members that are not for it to vote no. I mean, it's a recommendation. It's not in place yet until the board agrees.
I think that's a weak answer, and I think we deserve, as board members, we deserve the opportunity to have conversations with local people. It has not been vetted. Local people have not had a chance to look at this other than a few people who got advanced copies of this. And I got phone calls and I received emails and conversations today that said that they're really concerned about that. Is it totally, do we throw the whole thing away? Nope. We don't. But we look at it, but we don't pass it and figure it out later. I'm concerned about that. Somebody, Jason, I think you said premature. Somebody said premature. That our concerns were premature regarding the pathway panel's recommendations, and that's another example of no, it's not premature. Our concerns are on target. Our concerns should be on the table, and we should be talking about what does work and what doesn't work, and let's figure out the answer somewhere in the middle. It's important. We can't just throw things. In 2027, we don't want to look back at 2017 and say, what in the world were they thinking? In 2027, we want to look back and say, great decision in 2017. That's what's important. And we don't do that on an island. We don't do that in a bubble. We do that in cooperation with practitioners and people who deal with kids every day.
Sir, oh, can I address?
Just 1 second. Mary Ann was good, and then I'll get right to you. Sorry, Vanessa. Go ahead.
Thank you. I certainly had the opportunity to attend many of the morning sessions and listen in and be a part of the audience. I have great respect for everyone that's been involved in developing the policy as it stands. But I see the word misconception came out today. There have been different comments that have come out during the day that I can't help but think in my 33 years in public education that had there been more opportunity for people from the field to be a part of the conversation, we wouldn't have the misconceptions, we wouldn't have to be re-explaining things or putting out certain memos to try to define things. Had there been, or could there be, in the future, the opportunity to have more people from the field involved. And so I really look at this as an opportunity because I see there are so many positives that have come forth thus far, but for me, the work is not done. For me, there are more opportunities for the field to be involved, to have a voice. This is a tipping point of opportunity for the field to really stand behind. And I'm really proud of the public educators that have come forth and have made comment and have shared their beliefs. I agree with Dr. Yeager. Folks are not coming to complain. They're coming to say, this would make it more complete. Our students, I'm a proud new grandmother, a 4-month-old, and I look at the future for her. I look at the future for all of our children yet to come through our school systems. What can be accomplished by what this document and guidance will provide. So I hope that whether it's a memo on local pathways or thing that is going to impact students, that we are listening to people. I loved hearing how students were an influence on what you heard. I'd like to know how were the administrators' comments influence that document and the other collaborators that came forth. Because it's one thing to give input, it's another thing to be there at the table when it all comes together in a way that folks across all aspects have been heard. So again, I'm I feel very fortunate on this board. I feel very fortunate to hear the voices. There's a lot of positive here. This is an opportunity for us to move forward with everyone's support versus anything divisive. So.
I'm sorry, Vanessa.
I just want to address Dr. Yeager that I did serve on this panel as an educator at K. I'm a high school teacher, and I collaborate very closely with my superintendent and high school principal. I teach at a school, rural school of around 400. 60% of our high school seniors are out doing internships, and with their support, we felt this was very doable. I know my superintendent, Mary Robertson, is going to testify tomorrow. I know that we may be in a minority, but from the position where I teach, this was very doable for us, and I still support it. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Thank you.
Go ahead, and then I always yield to.
Well, also, kind of going back to what Dr. McMahon asked, how did we adjust and listen to the collaborators and those that came to the open mic and to the many, many emails. I mean, we've had, I think, 7 drafts, was it 6 or 7 different drafts, and if you look through each one of those, there's a progression because there's been adjustments made to concerns. And so I feel confident that we have, as a panel, tried to address those types of concerns with those amendments to each draft.
And Dr. Yeager, I have to comment here because I feel like we've been unfair to staff here because staff acted at my direction as they would any board member to support an idea that has come about. And therefore, I'll shoulder the responsibility that if we've done this wrong, but I stand by that I visited schools and I felt the concern, and so I felt like we needed to start something, and I just feel fortunate that we've got legislators that are excited about wanting to try to do something to help us. I know the governor's office also is, I am not speaking for them, but they're looking at how they could help implement this as well. And so, therefore, I want to make sure that everybody here understands if there's anybody to blame, anybody to be yelled at, it's me and not staff, because they acted at my direction as they would any board members, and I've appreciated the support on that, and I can't go without making sure that I say that.
Thank you. And once again, the locally created pathway parameters is not overall a bad thing. The vote on it with 3 days notice or 4 days notice is.
Well, and tomorrow we have our state board meeting, so if there are some items on the agenda that we need to take a look at, that would be an appropriate time to do so.
Now, per board operating procedures, 7 business days in advance.
Wouldn't it may?
Yes, I'm just saying tomorrow's a board meeting, correct? And the appropriate time to look at the agenda items would be tomorrow. Yes.
But one of the things that we said, and I want to be clear about this and make sure I'm clear on it. We said that there's a difference in the policy and the regulations that come from that. It seems to me that we're putting a regulation along with the policy. We're saying, here's the policy we are going to act upon. At the same time, we're actually implementing a regulation around one of these areas and defining what that looks like. What we've said is that we would give people an opportunity to look at those regulations, the implementation, to review those, to give us feedback on those, and then to pursue with the implementation of the plan. Is that accurate? Did I hear that earlier? And is it inaccurate to suggest that we're actually putting a regulation alongside the actual plan itself?
Well, and I think we would need clarification from an attorney on the regulatory situation of 1003.
So, yeah, they would not technically be regulations. So they would not be in board Title V or Title 511 regulations. They would be districts coming to the board saying, we would like approval for this innovative locally created pathway.
But we are going to be asked to vote on the regulations around what a locally created pathway must look like.
No, you're not. These are parameters you're basically empowering staff to go forward with an application. And these are the parameters around which we will build that application to approve potential locally created pathways. But this is not a final, this is not the piece that's going to the field for them to then apply. There still needs to be an application process. We need to figure out the application for current pathways versus the pilot grants. This is you just saying, we're empowering you to go forward based on these parameters. This discussion was to happen tomorrow, though.
So would this be considered guidance then? Is that a better term to use than regulation? It's guidance.
Guidance for a potential application that is forthcoming.
For a grant program to give schools support for planning. This is not, again, I go back to, and this is where studying our board materials matters. This is about a plan for how to give grants to schools to support planning, not what the final framework of what that would ever look like in terms of what it looks like for them.
Yeah, but the first part of that offers, that's not.
Why don't we cite to the materials that are in the binder?
The first part says we'll give 10 grants to school districts in Indiana. Well, there are only 400. I mean, we're going to give 10 grants under that, under what we pass tomorrow? I know, I heard that.
For planning grants.
Part 2 does not say.
Part 2 doesn't. Part 2 just said, I mean, there's a number of requirements
9.
that schools would have to meet to define a locally created pathway.
For going ahead and approving and not having to go through that process. So like a school corporation that's already doing this, like IPS, for example, who we can't move fast enough on this for, they could go ahead and be.
So one provision, for instance, says that my locally created plan we'd have to demonstrate that it's more innovative than the other pathways. So what I have to do is I have to come and show how my pathway that I've created for my students is more innovative than taking the ASVAB. That's one pathway, right? Or it's more innovative than any of these other things. I mean, to me, that is, yeah, they have to show that, but I'm having a difficult time separating that from our definition of what a locally created pathway is. How it's become more bureaucratic as opposed to more flexible.
So tomorrow, again, it's on the agenda. We can address it tomorrow if that means a removal of that item before the board meeting, but we have some agenda approvals to do tomorrow at the board meeting. So if there are that many concerns at a board meeting and our regular board meeting, we can address it as an agenda item.
I just want to piggyback on Byron's comments and board staff. Alicia and Brian drove to Evansville to sit in a hearing, a roundtable discussion. As someone who makes that drive frequently, it is not a fun drive. And drove to Austin to meet with those folks. Sat at the table, explained everything. I think brought a lot of comfort to the folks in Evansville and the folks in southeastern Indiana. And with regards to this, I think it's important, and again, we're discussing it. It should have been tomorrow, but it was brought up. So I think it's important that we understand that it is board staff's job to make recommendations to us. We can hold it, we can vote no, we can vote yes, we can do whatever we want to as a board, but that's what they do. So for us to be upset with the fact that they did their job, I don't understand.
I'm not upset that they did their job.
You just told them don't do that again.
No, I didn't. I didn't say that.
You have to stop doing that, I think, was the quote.
I don't think so. Board staff, and I've talked in depth with Matt and Brian about what board staff is, and they are to support all board members. And that's what they're doing. I'm not blaming you for putting that in there. That's if a board member says, I want this on the agenda, it goes on the agenda. I get that. Problem I have is who is involved in the creation. Not you, Dr. Ernest. But the fact that there were not practitioners involved in that, and that not just me, it's across the state, there's a concern about that. How can we involve folks who work with this every day? So please don't take that as a slam to the board. You guys did what you're supposed to do.
So tomorrow, again, we will address that memo as far as an agenda item. We can work with the board staff this evening as well. So any other, regarding the plan, any other questions, comments from the panel or the state board at this point? Did you have a comment, Brian?
I just want to say, I hope I'm still on Dr. Yeager's Christmas card list.
Any other comments or concerns? Okay, so at this time, I need a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor? Opposed? Thank you, audience, for coming. We appreciate it. Thank you, panel, for joining us.